Sgai yn gyntaf, croesawu pob un ohonoch chi, mae'n bleser i gymys i wneud na. A mae'r tro cyntaf fi'n credu bod ni wedi goffo dod â stolau miwn ma. Bod ddim ddigon o le. Mae hwnna yn hunan yn bwysig. So it gives me very great pleasure to welcome all of you this evening to this, the second Lampeter seminar in church history for this session. And a particular welcome to our guest, Dr. Eryn White, who's reader in history at the University of Aberystwyth. She specialises in early modern Welsh history, in particular Wales in the 18th century, religion in that context and in that period, and the role of women in that context as well. And she's recently published, so an entry on my iPad tells me, a study of aspects of the impact of the Welsh Bible on piety, literacy and culture. Indeed, I was remembering the first time we met was when you spoke to the Carmarthenshire Antiquarian Society on the anniversary, the quartercentenary of William Morgan's Bible. And in fact, she's at present the editor of that sister society's journal, Ceredigion. It reminds me I really should re-enlist. I was a member for some time. She's also written extensively on the Methodist revival in Wales, and the topic this evening is one of those Methodists, the Reverend David Jones of Llan-gan, of course, who is quite local because he came from this area. I've just been reminded by Professor Thorne from Llanclwni and Aberceiliog. One of those who did not wish to secede from the Church of England, but who would, I speak as member of the Church in Wales. And if his death in 1810 hadn't supervened, I suspect, I'm sure he would not have gone in 1811. He was also, of course, in this context, the grandfather of the first principal of this college, the Reverend Llewellyn, who will be the subject of our seminar next time. Eryn.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to be talking about David Jones of Llan-gan, but somewhat in the context of his period, and somewhat also in terms of how we remember him, how he has been remembered by different groups and different periods, perhaps. Now, I've got on the PowerPoint there 3 Anglican clergymen in their Geneva bands, which I thought would appeal to this particular audience. I'm sure you would be able to identify at least some of them. We've got, of course, David Jones of Llan-gan himself there on the left. I'm sure some of you will recognise the gentleman in the middle. Yes, Thomas Charles. Yes. This one perhaps not so well known. David Griffiths, Nevin. Yes. So there is, a comparison, I think, that is quite valuable between the 2 Davids, David Jones and David Griffiths, perhaps in particular. So we'll be paying some attention to the Davids, as it were, perhaps more than Thomas Charles in this particular paper. But we've got 3 Anglican clergymen here on the PowerPoint who were deeply influenced by the evangelical revival in the 18th century and early 19th century Wales. And the way they have subsequently been remembered has largely been determined by decisions they made around 1811, when the Methodists in Wales took the step to ordain ministers for the first time and to form the Calvinistic Methodist Church of Wales. Because that was a major milestone in the religious history of the country. I know you may not all approve of it, but we have to bear in mind that it did have a major impact. And it's not surprising, of course, that it figures prominently in Methodist accounts of their own history, but perhaps received rather less attention from the church's perspective. And of course, most 19th century histories of Methodism were produced by Methodists. So they do at times tend to gloss over some of the real controversies and uncertainties in the period leading up to 1811, and also perhaps downplay some of the negative effects. And the first real published historical account was by Robert Jones, Roslan, Drycher yn Seroedd, written in 1820. And he summed up the opposition to the ordination in this way. He said, "Some few in the south were unable to agree with the new order, and they have so far stood apart by themselves, but they are but few in number, and they do not have an adequate reason to justify their behaviour." Not at all unprejudiced. But I mean, Jones was 75 when he wrote this, 9 years after he delivered the charge to the new ministers at the Bala ordination in 1811, when they ordained the ministers for the north of the country. And he himself at that point had decided that he was too old to take the step to be ordained himself. So he simply gave the charge and advised those who were taking this step. But he was an eyewitness to the events in the north, which may actually have been rather less fraught than in the south, as we may see. And of course, that's the Methodist perspective. Some years later, Yr Hael, a journal which was rather more pro-Anglican, wrote that the split had perhaps been something of a wake-up call for the church, prompting it to take a greater interest, for instance, in matters of education. But otherwise, the Hael summed up the evangelical revival by saying that religious movements of this sort are essential at times of spiritual languor and moral corruption, but there is always a danger of carrying them too far into partiality, strife, and division, and rebellion against ecclesiastical authority. So a rather different point of view from Yr Hael, which is no great surprise. From the very opposite perspective, though, the existing nonconformist groups were somewhat perplexed about all the Methodist hand-wringing over the decision. Thomas Rees, in his famous and also completely impartial History of Protestant Nonconformity in 1861, wrote, "The opposition of the clergy to this change in the constitution of the Methodist body arose not only from what they saw would be its immediate result, the total and final separation of the connection from the established church, but also from the strange and superstitious tenacity with which they clung to the chimera of apostolical succession. The step taken by the Calvinistic Methodists in the memorable year 1811, which proved a mortal sin against a host of overzealous Episcopalians, was evidently well pleasing to the King of Zion, for the last 50 years have incomparably been the most prosperous period in the history of the connection." That's how you write history. So there are very different points of view, obviously. Now, of the three clergy I've got on display here, Thomas Charles famously remained a Methodist and left the church. David Griffiths, nearest to me here, remained an Anglican and left the Methodist cause. David Jones was not faced with the choice where to remain or who to leave, since he died in 1810 before the separation happened. So he was able to die both Anglican and Methodist. He has therefore been acclaimed in Methodist histories in much the way he was portrayed by William Williams Pantycelyn as Dafydd Onest o Llan-gan, honest David of Llan-gan, a preacher who, according to Pantycelyn, could melt the stones with the tenderness of his sermons and make the strongest oak bend as if it was as supple as a reed. Originally from Llanllwni in Carmarthenshire, Jones was ordained deacon. I should, yeah, got the facts there. He was ordained deacon, as we see then, 1758, then moved around quite a bit. There were times when it did seem to be quite a challenge to find a living in the 18th century, and there was often a lot of jostling and, seeking patronage. So we see him spending some time up in Carnarvon, in Tidweiliog to begin with, then moving back south to Llanafan Fawr in Breconshire, so back to St David's diocese. By 1760, he was ordained full priest and found himself in Monmouthshire, in Trefddyn and Caldicot. Then by 1764, he makes the leap to Wiltshire, to Crudwell. And that's quite important because it seems to be there that he became fully engaged with the evangelical movement and also made the connections then among some of the elite membership of the English movement that led to him being granted the post of Vicar of Llan-gan. And that came through the patronage of Lady Charlotte Edwin, with connections through Countess of Huntingdon, it seems. And of course, he remained at Llan-gan for the remainder of his life and became at the same time a prominent figure in the Methodist movement. You see that his first wife was Sinai Bowen from the Gwaeniffor family, a well-connected gentry family. There were quite a few of these lesser gentry families, not the most prominent, most wealthy, but there were quite a few of these lesser gentry families who were involved in the movement in the southwest, and the Bowens of Gwenivor were related to the Bowens of Llan-gan, and they were all taking an interest in to some degree. And after the death of his first wife, he then married a woman who appears sometimes as Mrs. Bowen, sometimes as Mrs. Bowen Parry, but she was a widow in Manor Owen in Pembrokeshire and quite comfortably off. We were just discussing how well the Methodists seem to manage to find wealthy widows. You know, I think they took to heart the proverb, don't marry for money, but marry where money is. There's a pattern there which certainly helped some of the more impoverished members. And of course, that meant as well that with that marriage in 1794, he spent a great deal of his time in his later years in Pembrokeshire, while his curate, William Howells, was actually chiefly responsible for Llan-gan. Even so, as long as his health allowed, he apparently did return for monthly communion in Llan-gan. And that was apparently very well attended because of his popularity as a preacher. And he does seem to have been generally much respected. We have quite an interesting account through the writing of Richard Fenton, the travel writer, who apparently had this chance encounter with David Jones when travelling through Pembrokeshire. They seem to have found themselves on the same coach. And Fenton didn't know who this gentleman was, but he was quite perplexed by the way that every time they stopped, he was greeted like some great celebrity. You know, this great enthusiasm, he couldn't quite understand. And then he realised that he was this Methodist preacher, and certainly in Pembrokeshire, very well known. And Fenton wrote about him that his whole appearance was such as inclined me to think that he did not lack the good things of this world, or forbear to make use of them from mistaken notion that they obstructed his passage to the next. There's an interesting take on marriage to a wealthy widow and the benefits it brings. But he also says that he was, in short, a communicative, sensible man with cheerfulness and good humour. But perhaps not what everybody's popular idea of a Methodist preacher might be. But I mean, it's curious that apart from MTH thesis by Brian Hyam in 1980, there hasn't been much published on David Jones himself. There was no blockbuster biography by Gomer M. Roberts, for instance, as there were for so many others. And that may partly be because he had fewer literary outputs than some of the other Methodists. His funeral sermon on the death of the Countess of Huntingdon was published, as was his biography of Christopher Bassett, who was a very talented young Anglican clergyman and Methodist who died of consumption aged around 30. But apart from that, he's not one of these figures who churns out hymns and other works in this period. Now, I mentioned the comparison between him and David Griffiths, and it has struck me the similarities perhaps between these two, David Jones and David Griffiths. They were both grammar school boys who, with some helpful patronage, became vicars of parishes, which they then served for over 40 years. They were both renowned preachers, much inspired by the evangelical revival. And along with Thomas Charles and Nathaniel Rowland, they were the clergymen most called upon by the Countess of Huntingdon to preach in the chapels of her connection. And I think, to some degree, that might also have influenced their desire not to leave the church, because possibly that gave them the experience of the difficulties that could arise. You know, the Countess of Huntingdon's connection did struggle to supply preachers, and they did rely very much on these 4 clergymen from Wales. So although obviously the Calvinistic Methodists in Wales had much more support and were probably better equipped, there was perhaps a certain element of warning there about what might happen if you did split. But it is a sign of the respect with which both were held as preachers that both David Griffiths and David Jones were called upon to help out. David Jones, for instance, was paid 16 guineas for serving for 8 weeks in the Countess's chapels in the spring of 1790, with an additional 10 guineas for travelling expenses. So it was probably worth the trip, yeah. And of course, he was very much respected because he was also, David Jones, called upon to preach in the Countess's funeral in Sparfields on the 3rd of July 1791. But by the late 18th century, David Jones and David Griffiths also happened to be based a few miles apart from each other in Pembrokeshire, and obviously worked together at times. We know, for instance, that the two preached at Fishguard in 1798 at the event to commemorate the successful seeing off of the French invasion of 1797. You know, the two of them apparently did go along to sort of view the French camp from afar. Not too close, I think, you know, but they did spy out the land and see what was happening. But there were differences in personality and possibly in the tone of their preaching. David Jones is said to have preached so sweetly that he disarmed some of those who came with the intention of opposing him, and he was described usually as a peacemaker rather than a leader. Archie Jenkins suggested that both Jones and Griffiths were more concerned with preaching, and that neither were much inclined to involve themselves in matters of organisation in the Methodist movement. Neither was really ever seen as a potential leader of the movement in the South, despite the respect always given to Anglican clergy. You know, one sees this always in the Methodist meetings leading up to 1811 and the split. You know, the clergy are always listed first as the Reverend Mr. Jones. You know, they're given a special status throughout. But even though Jones and Griffiths have this kind of respect, they don't seem to be, you know, identified as potential leaders in the movement in the South. Even though, in tributes after his death, Griffiths was described as someone who tended to take the lead in any given situation. And both certainly did chair meetings of the association in the South, and both argued very strongly against breaking away from the church. Griffiths does seem to have been the more dominant personality, who seemed to hold more sway when in the chair of the association. And both died as ordained clergy of the established church and not as Methodist ministers. So they have a lot in common, but the way they have been remembered in Methodist history is vastly different. And actually one of the key distinguishing factors is age. David Jones was 20 years older and did not have to face the same decisions as David Griffiths as a result. Now, although he hasn't received much individual attention from modern historians, Jones did figure in many of the 19th century volumes in a way that David Griffiths did not. And the explanation probably lies in the words of J. Morgan Jones and William Morgan, writing in their volume Atadau Methodistaidd in 1897. Some of you will be familiar with it. It's one of the pinnacles, really, of the sort of Methodist tradition of writing almost a hagiography of their history and of their leaders. And Jones and Morgan refer to those clergy that left the movement in 1811. And they say, the prize which was their part for turning their backs on their brethren was to be utterly forgotten. It could hardly have been expected otherwise. Certainly it did not belong to the Methodist to keep the memory of these clergy green, since they broke of their own volition through church prejudice and desire to keep hold of their livings, the association which had existed between them and the connection, and they did so with a great deal of bitterness of spirit. On the other side, the churchmen did not care to raise monuments to them because their previous connection to with the Methodists and the revivalist spirit which possessed them had made them completely unpopular amongst the majority of the clergy. Now, it's quite scathing, but there is a kernel of truth here in that these particular these Methodistically orientated clergy who left the movement in 1811 did really then, were really then fated to be ignored largely by Methodist histories, and perhaps did not figure greatly in Anglican accounts either. 19th century historians of the Methodist movement made efforts to collect and collate the oral history that was still available to them. Now, there were all sorts of anecdotes about the Methodist fathers passed on to the localities where they had visited. There are volumes recounting the growth of the cause in different regions in Wales, with tales of outdoor preaching to vast crowds commemorating the heroes of the revival. And we have that sort of information for Thomas Charles and David Jones, but not in the same way for David Griffiths. So men who had laboured for years in the Methodist cause, who had preached extensively and visited societies and associations, were not included in this collection of information in the same way. There is actually a story recorded in Arhail about David Griffiths being scheduled to preach at 11 in the morning one Sunday in Pembryn Church in South Ceredigion. I don't know if you know Pembryn Church, it's beautifully situated along the coast. And so David Griffiths was preaching there at 11 o'clock in the morning. At the end of the service, he was told that so many people had come to hear him that there was a crowd outside the door who had not been able to come in. And his response was apparently to climb out of the window, as you do, get onto a gravestone and apparently preach until sunset. Now, I hope it was December, because otherwise that was a very, very long sermon, you know. But I mean, it may be telling that this is a story recorded in Arhail that is associated to actual a church service, rather just to some of the more irregular places where Methodists might preach. But it's very much in the same sort of tradition as we see with the kind of accounts of Methodist preaching, you know, the preaching for hours to large crowds. But Methodist histories therefore said little about the so-called offeiriad darfu gefni, or the clergy who turned their backs. And this phrase has a very 19th century ring to it. And it very much reflects the viewpoint of 19th century Methodism, who thus categorized all the clergy who could not accept the decision of the associations in the north and the south to move towards the ordination of ministers. And the whole question of leave and remain is it's always horribly complicated, leave and remain, as we know, but it's really complicated in this instance, since all of the clergy, all of the Anglican clergy in the Methodist movement had to both leave and remain. If they remained Methodist, they would have to leave the church, as the movement made the transition to a nonconformist denomination. If they remained in the church, they would have to leave the Methodist cause. They had, in most cases, been a part of since around about the same time as they were ordained. So they would have to bid farewell to an important aspect of their spiritual, social, and cultural identity, as well as a large part of their personal history. Now, the fact that the separation didn't happen until after David Jones's death is perhaps not a complete coincidence. His death made it easier for the association in the South to move forward without fear of offending him. There had been a reluctance to take a step which so obviously would cause him distress. And this was a sign, of course, of the respect with which he was held. He was 74 years of age at this point, and there was a sense of not wishing to cause him pain. And that obviously affected the discussions that were being conducted in the association on the topic. But his death also worsened the situation by removing one more ordained clergyman from the ranks. But the Methodist Association meetings had been growing increasingly tense in the last years of David Jones's life. Because for decades, the movement had continued to urge its members to seek communion in the parish church. But there were large numbers who preferred to take communion only from the clergy who were also part of the Methodist movement. And that caused considerable practical difficulties. In North Wales, there were only 3 clergymen available to the Methodist cause: Thomas Charles and Simon Lloyd in Bala, and William Lloyd in Carnarvon. So with hundreds of chapels and thousands of members, it was just not feasible for these 3 to cater to everyone in the north. The position was less acute in the south, but in both north and south, there were growing calls for ordination and separation from the church, especially from the lay preachers who felt that they were fulfilling just about all the duties of pastoral care over societies, apart from ministering the sacraments. And there was something of a generational gap here. Robert Jones admitted that some of the younger men were pushing forward impulsively and perhaps not always thinking about the implications. When one association meeting in 1810 reached a sort of impasse, it was decided to close the discussion and retreat to pray on the question. And David Jones's response was famously, "Do not pray me out of the world. I will be gone soon enough." Actually, he was quite right. He died shortly after that. He'd previously told the association that he had risked his daily bread by spending so much time in their company. And there were suggestions, of course, that those who clung to the church did so because of material reasons, for fear of losing their income. And in all fairness, that was no small consideration for some of them. But for those like Jones, there was also the matter of losing the connection to a parish after decades of baptizing, marrying, and burying its people, which must have been painful to consider as well. So it was extremely complicated for all those concerned. We have there the list of the leavers and remainers. I found the more I was thinking about this, the more Brexit is kind of looming at the back of my mind. It was hard to discuss this without talking about leave and remain. But this is the problem, of course. Leaving Methodism means remaining in the church. Leaving the church meant remaining Methodist. So the Methodist histories portrayed those who departed the Methodist movement and remained in the church as those who turned their backs. They are the offeiriad darfi gefni. And that's become the common phrase. But of course, they leave from the Methodist perspective. They stay, they remain from the church perspective. So it's very much a question of your point of view. And I've added the ages there because I think that is actually quite worth considering. I mean, it's not a complete generational gap. The youngest here are those who remained Methodists. We have Richard Bassett, who was 34, for instance, and William Lloyd was 40. So the average age is a little bit lower on this side. But in general, one can see part of the problem here is that there were so few were under 50. The vast majority were over 50. And so that was a sign of the issue, that the ranks of the ordained clergy were not being replenished in the movement. You know, that they were not going to be able to sustain this for much longer. If they were going to rely on these for the sacrament, at some point that was going to become increasingly problematic. So that's part of the issue facing the Methodist cause is the aging clergy that they had, really. Now, there is sometimes the sort of suggestion that there was a complete and utter division, with neither side having anything to do with the other thereafter. But that's not always the case at a local level, it seems. We have, for instance, Howell Howells here in Glamorgan, who did remain Methodist, but didn't have to leave the church straight away. He was 61 at the time, and seemed to have been able to continue as the incumbent in Trehill in Glamorgan, and also acting as a Methodist. It was in 1818 he was warned by Bishop Herbert Marsh of Llandaff that if he wanted to remain in his benefice, he had to turn his back on Methodism. He'd managed for 7 years to escape that kind of attention. He did choose at that point to leave the church. He went out quietly without any kind of fuss, it seems, decided to turn to farming instead to make a living, and lived to the ripe old age of 92. He died in 1842. So for some, it wasn't an immediate departure from the church. We see Richard Bassett, the youngest here, was in a similar position. He was also keeping a foot in both camps. He was curate of St Athards and Llandau. He went on later to become rector of Eglwys Brewis and Colwinston in Glamorgan. And he was warned in the same way by Bishop Marsh. But the timing worked slightly better for Richard Bassett, because Marsh was translated to the bishopric of Peterborough in 1819 before any final decision was reached about Richard Bassett's position. And it seems that the subsequent bishops in Llandaff, William van Mildert, Charles Sumner, Edward Copleston didn't seem to take any further steps. So we have Richard Bassett remaining in the church and also helping out with the Methodists. So he's the only one really who managed to do that. There were some others not listed here in a slightly more ambiguous position. William Howells, for instance, who'd been David Jones of Llan-gan's curate. He moved to London, actually to a parish in London after Jones's death in 1810. And so wasn't really active in the Welsh Methodist movement, but retained an association and support. We also have the brothers Daniel and Hezekiah Jones there, who are listed as leaving. At least Hezekiah retains sort of friendly associations with Methodism. So although they are down as having turned their backs and having left, they don't seem to have disagreed in principle and seem to have continued to offer some kind of support locally. So some of the visions here are not as sharp as perhaps later 19th century writers tried to suggest. Of course, another thing that made it easier for a lot of those who decided to leave the church and remain Methodist was the fact that they were not actually in benefices at this point. They were not parish clergy. So, I mean, Thomas Charles, for instance, John Williams Pantycelyn, John Williams Pantycelyn, they were not actually active parish clergy. So the decision was not so difficult in those cases. Now, one of the areas most affected was Pembrokeshire. If we see those who left Methodism and remained in the church, we can see the number there from Pembrokeshire. David Davis, David Griffiths of Nevern, William Jones of St Dogmell's, and David Pugh in Newport. So there were 4 members of the clergy in Pembrokeshire. So Pembrokeshire had actually been in a really fortunate position up until this point. Also until 1810, they'd had David Jones spending much of his time there. So they could call on 5 members of the ordained clergy to help out in the Methodist movement. So the change there was more dramatic than anywhere else, really, because they'd been so much more privileged before then. So all 4 of the clergy there in Pembrokeshire departed. And it's generally assumed that it was David Griffiths' influence that was one of the key factors, that he had a substantial influence on the other clergy in Pembrokeshire. But you know, their own allegiance to the church may very well have been a factor. It's not hard to see why somebody like David Pugh of Newport at the age of 72 did not fancy change, you know, and thought, well, I'd better stay where I am. But it brings us back, of course, to David Griffiths as a character, who was, of course, very influential. One of the key factors here with David Griffiths, of course, is the connection to the Bowen family of Llan-gan. That's what enabled him to get the position as Vicar of Nevern in 1783, where he remained for the rest of his life. He became, of course, private tutor to the Bowen family. And as we've said, you know, these Methodists knew how to marry. So he married the daughter of George Bowen Llan-gan and never looked back, you could say. You can see there the Bowen family homes. It doesn't come through very well on the map. See Nevern there, of course, and then Llan-gan nearby, and Bury there is where David Griffiths spent a lot of his life. So there's a number of houses around Nevern that were very much part of the Bowen family estate. And that, of course, is the church that David Griffiths was vicar of, Church of St Brynach, Nevern. You can see that great cross, which is associated with it. The mounting block there, where those who came riding to church were able then to get back on their horses. I mean, it is a very beautiful church. So I don't have to tell you, many of you are familiar with Nevern. I was actually happened to be at a wedding there last spring. I was probably the only person in the congregation who was thinking of David Griffiths. But it was a beautiful day, and we went outside, and of course, you know, Nevin, it's very quiet. Everybody was able to just walk around the road, and there were no cars anywhere. And you thought, well, I do understand why he wanted to stay. I'm not being paid by the Nevin Tourist Board. They don't need my help. You can see the attraction of like Nevin spending 40 years there, parish priest. He was, as I say, then married into the Bowen by that Swingwide Manor hotel. And you see, of course, he married and the daughter of George Bowen. Their daughter Dorothea then did the classical thing of marrying her cousin. So she married James Bowen. The family ties continuing there. I got quite tangled up with the family tree at one point, and I began to think she'd married her uncle, but I'm getting worried. So all is well. Very Hill House, where David Griffiths spent a good deal of his time. So I just give them an idea of the sort of rather comfortable life that David Griffiths led in this period. And as I say, one can see why he would want to choose to remain as Vicar of Nevin. His loss from the Methodist movement and his hostile attitude was actually taken quite seriously. And Thomas Charles's brother, David Charles, was empowered to write to David Griffiths to request a meeting to seek some sort of reconciliation. But Griffiths' response was an emphatic refusal, expressing regret at the unhappy spirit which had broken the unity which had lasted for so many years. And Griffiths actually seems to have been doubtful of the response on both sides to the ordination. Actually, not long after 1811, both William Cleaver in St Asaph and Thomas Burgess in St David's authorised the ordination of young men who were not graduates and who were evangelically inclined, candidates who were perhaps not dissimilar to the new Methodist ministers. And it was said that David Griffiths at the time had welcomed Burgess's policy, but had also had some reservations, which some 10 years before his death in 1834, he confided to a friend. And he said that he feared that Burgess was not always able to discern between genuine piety and the appearance of piety, and so overlooked some that did not have popular appeal. And some of those he had favoured, Griffiths had always feared would lose their enthusiasm at whatever point Burgess ceased to be bishop of the diocese. And Griffiths claimed that he had been proven right, although he's not naming names. I don't know if I'm allowed to criticise Thomas Burgess in Lampeter, but this is David Griffiths feeling slightly uncertain about Burgess's policy. And of course, where the split was bitter, as it was in Pembrokeshire, there were additional issues. Many of the Methodist chapels actually had clergy like David Griffiths named as trustees. Again, it's a sign of the sort of respect in which they were usually held, that they would often be named as trustees of chapels. And of course, that then had all sorts of implications because the clergy felt legally entitled not to transfer the buildings to the new Methodist denomination in some cases. And it said, for instance, that Richard Bassett in Glamorgan ensured that the Methodists still had use of their buildings. So where there was greater, friendship and alliance continuing, this problem was overcome. But where the split was rather more bitter, one can see this becoming a real problem. So the chapels at Nevin, Newport and St Dogmell's were closed to the Methodists, with David Griffiths and William Jones taking possession in the name of the church. And one can see how this led to ill feeling, since the money for such buildings was usually raised by the members. The argument from the church's perspective was that the money had been raised by members of the church for use by people who were members of the church with no thought of leaving it. And one can, there is a difference in perspective here, obviously. For the Methodists, it seemed like daylight robbery, but for the clergy of the church, they could stick to the letter of the law. And after a lapse of time without any meetings in Eglwys Uru, the chapel there had not been used for a while, and there was an attempt to reclaim it by the Methodists in the 1840s. And they based this on an argument that by actually beginning to hold association meetings in the early 1740s. The early Methodists had actually gone against the 9th canon of the church by meeting separately. This is a very subtle, clever argument. So they say that in effect, the Methodists had left the church before the chapel had been built, because the association meeting was in effect a departure from the church, which broke the 9th canon. Of course, this falls flat because the Toleration Act of 1689, in essence, made the 9th canon irrelevant. The Methodists had the opportunity to choose to register their chapels under the 1689 Act, and they did not take that step. They didn't have that protection from the law. So it was a little bit dodgy to then fall back on old ecclesiastical laws, but they gave it a go, fair play. There was actually, they took this appeal to the Lord of the Manor, Thomas Lloyd of Bronwydd, who was regarded as a fairly benevolent landlord, and they put the case to him. And Lloyd did actually come to the conclusion that the Methodists probably did have a right to the chapel, but possession is 9/10 of the law, and the vicar had the key. So that was that. Lloyd's suggestion came to nothing. So, David Griffiths and some of his fellow clergy were probably not held in high esteem amongst Pembrokeshire Methodists as a result. But he is praised in some Welsh medium periodicals on the more conservative and pro-Anglican side. His name was often cited in accounts of the history of Nevern as one of the notable incumbents of the parish, whose preaching was remembered as extremely effective. He was also, of course, active in Madam Bevan's educational charity. And we're coming back here, of course, to the Bowen connection, the Bowens of Llwyn-Gwawr. George Bowen, David Griffiths' father-in-law, was a great benefactor to the circulating schools, particularly under the management of Bridget Bevan. After Griffith Jones died, of course, Bridget Bevan continued to manage the circulating schools up until 1779. And George Bowen was one of the 4 trustees named to take charge of the legacy left to the schools in her will. She left £10,000 to maintain the school, and some of that, of course, was money collected for the schools. And so George Bowen, Zachariah Bevan, and Bridget Bevan's niece and nephew, Eliza Stepney and William Lloyd, were named as the 4 trustees. I usually, when at the mention of Eliza Stepney and William Lloyd, I am mentally going boo hiss in the back of my mind. They decided to try and prove the will without consulting the other 2 trustees in order to take the money and deprive the schools of the money that had been left to them. And it was George Bowen who actually took the case to Chancery to challenge what they were doing. And Chancery takes its own sweet time. And he was the only one of the 4 trustees to live long enough to see the outcome of the case. And by 1809, the 10,000 had actually grown to 30,000, and it was given to the schools. But of course, by that point, they had ceased to be. It was too late. To a large degree, of course, the Sunday schools had taken over some of their work. But it did mean that a charity could then be set up in Madam Bevan's name. And of course, it did have its main training centre in Newport, Pembrokeshire. And a lot of that is to do with the Bowen family connection. So what we're seeing here with the Bowens, in a sense, is a sort of network of individuals in the Southwest who seem to have inherited some of the pietistic influences behind the SPCK activities in the area as well. It's a long-standing trend in Carmarthenshire and Pembrokeshire, of course, with the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge. And David Griffiths carried on with this. He became very involved in the work that his father-in-law was doing. So there's an involvement here with Welsh charity schools that preceded the evangelical revival and continued after it as well in Pembrokeshire. So he did some good, I think we can say. And some of David Griffiths' letters are actually been preserved and show a very human side to the man, especially in his letters to his family. He writes to his daughter Dorothea. She'd been in Bath for a while and came back to Brydell near Cardigan to set up home, anticipating the birth of her first child. and her father writes to her to say, "Are you sure the house has been properly aired?" Which is the sort of thing my mother would have said. So it comes very much, from him. And then after the child is born, she has this idea of bringing the child to Nevern to be baptized, because she thinks this would be, very appropriate. And he pretty much tells her, well, don't be silly. You're much better off having the child baptized nearer to home, so in case you and the child might catch a cold if you have to go out. And in a lot of his letters, he does seem to be suffering from a cold. So there's this constant theme of trying to stop catching cold. It's a very 18th century preoccupation and 19th century preoccupation with health, I think. I have to say, I was particularly struck by, I think it's his very last letter, David Griffiths. He wrote to his sister on the 29th of March, 1834, not long before his death, explaining that he was confined to his home, to his house, Berry Hill, because of his infirmity. He'd been unable to make the journey down to Nevern Church for the last 4 months, and therefore had been unable to preach. And he says that he has been preaching for 54 years and now was unable to do so, and he felt utterly useless. And without it, said, the only pleasure he had in life. And said his only hope now was to be free from this body of sin through the love of God. And it put me very much in mind of William Williams Pantycelyn's last letter to Thomas Charles, in which he complained about the fact that after 50 years of preaching, he was reduced to travelling from the bed to the fire and back. And he says, William says he'd travelled the equivalent of 4 times around the world. He calculated the miles he'd done year on year. And he says, now I'm reduced to bed, fire, and back. So it's the same sense there of the preacher unable to preach, losing the capacity to actually physically being able to do it. And of course, that compulsion to preach was something that David Griffiths and William Williams shared with David Jones as well. Whether wearing Geneva bands or not, there was, this fundamental principle that united them. But history has divided them along very sharp denominational lines in ways that they probably would never have foreseen when their involvement with the evangelical revival was at its height, and they were preaching to crowds too large for parish churches to contain. And those divisions have made it extraordinarily difficult just to know how to categorize them in a neutral way that doesn't show preference for either church or Methodism. If you say that somebody left in 1811, you are taking the Methodist point of view. So leave and remain, as I say, continues to be so complicated and continues to trouble us. But David Jones, of course, has remained in the Methodist memory. But had he lived a little longer, one does wonder whether he too might have been consigned to that category of offeiriad darfi gefni, whose memory did not deserve to be kept green. Okay, thank you.